Kia ora everyone, it's great to have you here at today's session on what our advice could mean for New Zealanders. Ko Charlie Keeling-aho, I'll be taking us through this session today. I'm a Senior Communications and Engagement Advisor here at the Commission. But first we have Bevan Hunter, a Principal Advisor in our Corporate Services team, who's working on our internal capabilities here at the Commission. And we're really happy to have Bevan here to lead us into this session with a karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, I runga I te pāka whakata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa. I te matua I te rangi, mana ki tia mātou I tēnei wā, a kona mātou kia mahitahi, kia tū kotahi tātou I tēnei wā, ko koe hoki tō mātou kaiarahi I ngā wā katoa. Amen. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So before we get started, it'd be great if, as usual, you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent while I'm talking, and let us know where you're joining us from in Aotearoa. As always, it's great to see who's joining us in these sessions since we can't see your faces. So while you're doing that, I'll give you a bit of an update in terms of what we've been up to here at the Commission. As you're all hopefully aware by now, we released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets on the 31st of January. And at 9 AM on the 1st of February, consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. We've actually just extended the deadline for receiving submissions on our advice to Sunday the 28th of March. We heard that some people needed more time to consider this important piece of work, and we're really pleased that we can provide that. So that means until then, you can make a submission and tell us what you think about our advice. I'll post a link to our consultation page in the chat at the end of the session. And I just want to note it's really important to remember we're open to changing our advice to reflect what we hear during this consultation period. So we're really keen to hear from you and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. During this session, you'll hear from our expert team and have the opportunity to ask questions. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions. And we won't have time to answer all the questions on the call, unfortunately, but we'll get to as many as we can during the next hour. And if you want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, feel free to use the chat. A lively chat is really great for giving our team feedback. And we will be recording this session so we can capture the questions, and we'll be making it available on our website if you want to look at it again after. So for now, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Karen and Carly, who will be kicking us off with today's session.
Thanks, Charlie. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Carly Sue aho. I'm a Senior Analyst in the Emissions Budgets team at the Commission. This session is focused on what our advice means for New Zealanders. If we could kind of get the slides going, that would be great. It's specifically framed on the impacts to households, businesses and communities. I'm going to start off by giving a bit of introduction to our advice and then cover what our advice can mean for households. Then Karen will then cover what the impacts on businesses. We'll then go to questions and I'll finish by talking about the impacts to communities. Again, please feel free to use the chat function and pop your questions in the Q&A. If we can just click to, I think it's the next. Oh, yep, great. That's great. Yeah, so our advice. In short summary, we found that we can reach net zero of long-lived gases and reduce methane significantly by 2050. But we won't reach our targets using under current policy settings. We need work to get there, and work must be accelerated. And there are critical actions for us to get there. Next slide, please. That was just a list of the webinars that I mentioned earlier. Feel free to go check them out. Next slide. So what does this mean for New Zealanders? In general, our analysis has shown that we can reduce emissions while improving overall living standards. So we can have warmer homes, improve transport, more space for nature. And we know that some of these impacts will not be evenly distributed. So government needs to think about how to provide targeted support. Next slide. What does this mean for households specifically? So the impacts of taking action on climate change for households will depend on their size, location, and lifestyle. In our analysis, we looked at the cost to households from electricity and transport. We found that the costs will change over time, but that taking action on climate change will not significantly change household bills. Our analysis shows there could be cost savings from switching to low carbon alternatives such as heat pumps and insulation, or switching to EVs. Making energy efficiency improvements may also help to save money, such as energy efficiency lighting or appliances. For households that use natural gas for heating and cooking, they may see price rises. Now, we're not asking anyone to replace fossil fuel gas lines that are installed and working well. People with fossil fuel gas in their homes or barbecues can still keep using them. There was a presentation earlier on electricity costs, and you can check that out on our website too. Households can also reduce costs by replacing things on their natural replacement cycles with low emission substitutes. So this means replacing things with low emission options when they're going to replace them anyway. That's like looking at heat pumps when you need a heater, or an electric vehicle or an e-bike as a new way to get around. And in our analysis, we found that low-income families can save about $800 a year after installing insulation, compared to $200 for higher income families. This helps to reduce time off school or work, the number of GP visits and hospital admissions. It means less time spent on medicine and reduced mortality, and also reduces the burden on the health system. However, we know that the impacts and benefits from our advice will not be distributed evenly. Not all households will have the same resources or capacity to do things like buying EVs or installing heat pumps. Low-income households, for example, or households that live in remote areas. Because Māori and Pacifica households are disproportionately represented in low-income statistics, they are also disproportionately impacted by increases in household bills. That's why it's essential that targeted assistance is needed to help those affected groups and make sure that our transition to a low-emission society is fair and doesn't burden some. If supportive policy is designed well, it could help to reduce existing inequalities, such as the health co-benefits from warmer, drier homes. Next slide, please. We also looked at transport. Thank you. We also looked at the impacts on household travel costs. Our advice shows that costs could increase for households that use petrol or diesel cars. However, things like improving vehicle fuel efficiency, switching to EVs, public transport, and walking and cycling can help to reduce those costs. There are other benefits as well as saving money. Walking and cycling also have significant health co-benefits. More public transport, walking, and cycling will have a positive emissions impact, particularly on those who live in cities and urban areas. We also know that some of these options are not accessible to everyone. Some low emissions options are just too expensive, or the infrastructure is not available or safe. For example, people who live in remote or rural areas can't access public transport easily. So public transport is currently not the realistic option for many people. Good policy and planning will be needed to ensure that the transport systems are integrated and accessible. There needs to be better transport options to increase access, particularly for people with disabilities or on low incomes. Having an integrated public and shared transport network, both locally and across Aotearoa, including trains and coaches, and better transport planning, will improve the ways that people can connect and encourage a shift in the way we live and move around. The government would also need to provide proactive and targeted support to help lower income households reap the benefits of electric vehicles and bring down the costs. While electric vehicles are cheaper to operate and maintain, they do have a high upfront cost. So policies that encourage a second-hand EV market, car sharing and leasing, and support the purchase of an electric vehicle or e-bike could also help. That's it for me. I think Karen is next to talk about what this means for businesses.
Yeah, just a quick reminder, if anyone does have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box and we'll be happy to answer them at the end.
Cool, thanks Carly and Charlie. Can you please flip through to the next slide? Cool, thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa, called Karen Lavin aho. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the impacts of the climate transition on businesses. So some of you will have heard in the media and seen in our advice that our analysis shows that meeting the 2050 target will cost less than 1% of projected annual GDP in 2050. However, that doesn't tell us about who bears those costs. It also doesn't tell us about the opportunities and benefits of acting or the risks of delaying action. Carly mentioned improved health outcomes. That's a really important one and a benefit of acting on climate change. There's also risks of delaying the transition, such as to stranded assets, market access, or international reputation. So we've been asked a lot about what this means for businesses, and there isn't a simple answer. It will vary from business to business. It will depend on the goods and services that each business provides. It will depend on where they're located, and it will depend on their particular goals. So each business will need to do their own assessment to understand what the sources of their emissions are for their business, the options for reducing those emissions, and what works for them in their context. And many of the businesses that we've been talking to are doing that already. So one part of that is for businesses to look at how they use electricity, petrol, natural gas and coal. So that's their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. As we proceed with the transition, businesses that use fossil fuels will pay more for the associated emissions. And there are changes that businesses can make to reduce those costs. So for example, a business could offset higher petrol prices by reducing travel. They could replace their car or their fleet with more fuel-efficient cars, or better yet, with electric vehicles. And it's just worth noting that while an electric vehicle at the moment is expensive to purchase, the running costs are much lower. So there will be costs for businesses to replace fossil fuel assets with low emissions substitutes, but businesses can reduce those costs by replacing those assets on as natural a cycle as possible, so when they're naturally going to replace them anyway. So Carly mentioned the same for families and households. So for example, when it's time for a new boiler for the building, making it electric or biomass if possible. And so that's a really important aspect that we've factored into our analysis, so that that means that our proposed emissions budgets can be met by replacing these assets on their natural replacement cycle. A key concern that we've heard from businesses is that the costs of the transition could reduce how competitive they are in international markets, and that's particularly the case if their competitors internationally don't face those same costs. And that could have unintended consequences of increasing global emissions if production was to move offshore to competitors that aren't as efficient with their emissions as producers in New Zealand are. So there are ways to manage and mitigate those risks. It's not a reason to not pursue climate action. At the moment, we have industrial allocation in the emissions trading scheme, and that's the main method we use to manage that risk at the moment. And it's very effective at doing that. And it's also something that the Commission will be monitoring over time, what those risks are. There are also opportunities for businesses from the transition. So new technologies will be needed. So there will be opportunities for businesses to develop new low emissions products and services. I mentioned just a moment ago about the risks to market access of not reducing emissions. So we're already seeing businesses responding to consumer demand for low emissions products. There are some businesses that are looking at their scope 3 emissions. So that's the emissions across their supply chain. And that provides opportunities for businesses that provide low emissions goods and services. But at the same time, it's a risk for businesses that don't. So given the time, most businesses will be able to respond. They'll be able to adapt and innovate and commercialise new ideas. At the same time, we do need to acknowledge that there will be some industries that may no longer be viable in a low emissions world. And the coal mining and oil and gas sectors will be impacted by that transition away from fossil fuels. And that will particularly affect regions where those industries currently provide significant employment. So while these industries are already declining, our proposed emissions budgets could speed that up and possibly result in 600 to 1,100 fewer jobs across both the coal and oil and gas sectors by 2035. So it's going to be really important to ensure that there is time to phase down in a planned way. We particularly need to think about the workers in those industries and the communities that they support. These workers have important skill sets that are going to be valuable in other sectors and new industries that emerge as part of the transition. So there will be new opportunities, particularly in areas like the circular economy, the development of biofuels and hydrogen industries, and in deploying and supporting new technologies. So a well-signalled transition will be needed to allow time for those workers to retrain and redeploy into new areas of work. So the key message that I guess is really coming out here is that the transition needs to be well planned and signalled. We've heard really clearly from businesses that we've engaged with that policy needs to be stable and predictable. And that predictability is really important to be able to make investment decisions, and particularly low emissions investment decisions. So I'll pass back to Charlie. I think we'll see if some questions have come through, and then Carly's going to follow up after that and talk a bit more about what this means for communities.
Thanks, thank you both, that was great. And we've got a few questions through, so I'll just ask a couple now. What does this mean for students and young people?
Thanks for that question, Charlie. I think for the forefront for students, something we haven't quite mentioned here is one of the things that we've had to think about in our analysis is the need to think about the impact on current and future generations. So that concept of intergenerational equity. For students, it's also realizing that they may fall into groups that may not have access to certain technologies, such as electric vehicles or being able to get heat up in their home. So I think that what we're trying to do with these impacts is making sure the government thinks about students as that group and thinks that and provides the targeted support that they need in order to access those technologies. Another part of the students' equation is also education, which we also didn't really touch on, and the fact that climate change will, or the impacts of advice will be part of, I'm sorry, I just missed my point there. I think that would have answered the question, yeah.
Thanks, Carly, that was great. We've got another one here. What is the role of income support in managing the transition?
Income support, I think, as we said, it's important to provide targeted support to those affected groups. We haven't gone deeply into providing or giving examples of the types of income support that can be given. So looking specifically at, the tax welfare group recommendations. I think that's part of a policy decision that government needs to work on with different agencies. What we'll try to do here is set the policy direction and give the impetus for departments to start looking at these issues more closely.
Sorry, I've just got another one here. I was just reading it. And we've got one that's saying, what are the characteristics of the households that are worse off, for example, financially or less able to warm themselves, etc., from climate intervention?
Yeah, I can answer that one, and I see there's a few parts to it. So first, does your analysis assume that everyone has improved well-being by climate intervention? And no, our analysis doesn't assume that. It's going to be very dependent on how we go about the transition. So as Carly mentioned, the advice that we've provided is advice on the direction of policy. It's going to be very much dependent on what policy the government chooses to put in place as to how various people will be impacted. In particular, in terms of the characteristics of those who might be worse off. In particular, we need to be thinking about low-income households. But at the same time, there are things that we can do to be supporting those households. We know that insulation, for example, can be a massive benefit, and we can start to, through schemes like providing insulation, we can start to reduce some inequities, and particularly health inequities. So I think, for example, if we were to install insulation in a low-income household, it can save $800 a year on average just in health costs. That doesn't include the social benefits, compared to about $200 for a higher income household. So there's certainly some things that we can do to try and help that. I guess the other characteristics of households that could be impacted will be those people whose income is impacted, particularly people who work in sectors that may no longer be viable as part of the transition. And so that's where targeted support there is also really important. And going back to that key message that if this is well signalled and well targeted, then that's what allows us that time to plan and make sure we can get those mechanisms in place to help with that. Hopefully that answers that question, Charlie.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. That was really great. I'll just ask a couple more before we move on again. Given the urgency of action needed, why not go faster?
Yeah, and so probably one of the main judgments that we've needed to make in this advice is the pace with which we act. And so that's, I guess there's four key pieces of evidence and analysis that we've been building up to help inform that. One is how can we be ambitious and contribute to the global 1.5 degree goal. One is about being technically and economically feasible. One is about ensuring that the transition is fair and equitable and that we can manage any negative impacts. And the final one is that it can be delivered through policy. And so the ambition is a really key one, but at the same time, we also need to be thinking about what's technically and economically feasible. And there are some really practical things that we have to think about. So, for example, electric vehicles is a really good example there. How quickly can we get electric vehicles into the country? So there are supply constraints and things like that we've had to think carefully about when we're weighing that up. So we do think that what we're proposing does hit that ambitious but achievable, which is what we're required to do under the Act, and particularly for long-lived gases. There's a really nice figure in our report that shows that the path that we're proposing would be putting us on track to net zero long-lived gases by about 2040. So we consider that is ambitious. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. I'll just ask a couple more before we move on to the next section. On businesses, your modelling assumed TY Point would close. Are the job losses from that closing included in your analysis of job losses?
Hi, no, yes, so in terms of TY Point, that was something that's included in our baseline of our modelling, and it's something that we'll be looking at in more detail for the final advice as well. So in terms of that, because it's in the baseline, it's not something that then pops out in our scenarios, but of course we're very aware of that and very aware of the job losses that are going to occur there as well.
Thanks, Karen. We'll just do one more before we move on, so we've got more time for questions at the end. How does the Commission hold the government to account if it fails to develop and deliver well-signalled transition policies?
I guess that means if the government fails to. Yes, so in terms of the Commission, we're an independent Crown entity established under the Climate Change Response Act. And so we've got a few different functions. So one is providing advice on the level of emissions budgets, which is what we've done here, and the direction of policy. You'll see that in the advice, we have a variety of different recommendations in the policy space. Sorry, my background's a bit noisy. Some of them we consider to be really time-critical recommendations. And in that case, we've included progress indicators for the government, many of which are in the next 5 years. And we also have a role monitoring the government. So every year we will assess their progress against budgets and emissions targets. And so those progress indicators will help us to see how well they're going against making progress. But as we do need really swift and decisive action on climate change. And so there's a lot of policy work that needs to happen in the next few years to get us to where we need to get to.
Thanks, Karen. I think we'll go back to Carly now. I think is it Carly who's doing the next presentation?
Yep.
But I can share the screen again.
Thank you.
Just bear with me.
That's great. Yep, that's the one. Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Charlie. So as Karen mentioned before, there are multiple co-benefits to the wider community from taking climate actions, such as the immediate health benefits from warmer, drier homes, from less pollution, from walking and cycling more, but also the biodiversity benefits from more native forestry. Different groups of society, regions and sectors will be affected in different ways, and we need to think about how these impacts are distributed. So that's thinking about the impact on rural communities, low-income groups, disability community, iwi Māori and other ethnicities. For example, the impact on iwi Māori will be different given the diversity between iwi and hapu and due to the unique characteristics of different takiwa. So care needs to be taken to ensure that our climate actions do not place disproportionate restrictions on iwi Māori or compound further grievances. Our advice recommends that the government publish a plan to partner with iwi Māori and local government implement emission reduction pathways and actions. We've also heard about concerns on land use and how that could impact rural communities and towns. That's why in our approach, we've prioritised decarbonisation and reducing our emissions. We've also recognised that some low carbon options may not be accessible to low income groups, which is why it's essential to have well-designed policies with equity at the forefront. And I think a few comments and questions were raised about that before. Without this targeted assistance, some policies could have adverse effects on the most vulnerable. And thinking about the future, new skills, knowledge and capability will be needed in the workforce. The current approaches to skills and training will need to change to prepare the current and future workforce for the rapid change needed. That's why we've recommended that the government develop policies to create a workforce with the skills needed to accelerate the low emissions transition. This means assessing how the education system can support New Zealanders with the skills needed for the future. We need to think about the skill sets that enable workers to adapt and have lifelong learning. It's essential that we upskill and redeploy workers from high emission sectors. I think Karen mentioned this before, these workers have really essential skills that we really need in the workforce. Vocational education and training systems will need to enable changing skill demands. And we also need to develop skills and training into low emissions industries by Māori for Māori. That also includes addressing the barriers that restrict certain New Zealanders from participating in education and training. This is a recommendation that we've provided for the government. There will also be regions and communities that will be more affected than others. Localised transition planning will be needed where communities work together to tailor a transition plan that is particular to their needs and aspirations. It will need to be inclusive, transparent, and co-developed through a bottom-up approach that involves iwi Māori, local government, local communities, businesses, civil society groups, and other stakeholders. As Karen said before, a well-signalled transition will give people time to plan and for affected workers to redeploy or retrain and put people at the heart of our transition. And that's it for the communities. Thanks, Charlie. We can break for questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just managing the slides. We've had a couple of good questions come through, so I'll just ask those now. Does the Commission have some specific suggestions for how to encourage a greater number of active transport trips in urban areas? At the moment, there seems to be a greater focus on getting individuals to purchase EVs.
Yeah, so I can take this one. We do have a recommendation about developing an integrated national transport network to help reduce private travel and to increase walking, cycling, and public and shared transport. In terms of the specific directions, I'm sorry to say it again, but the role of the Commission is to provide that policy direction. However, we do encourage you to provide in your submissions any specific suggestions you might have for that. I think encouraging people to use active transport requires looking at the infrastructure and the entire systems. And although EVs has a lot of our media attention, it's not a full part of our transport advice, and it's part of the package of an integrated transport system.
Thanks, Carly, that was great. Have you considered the importance of community development and community organising in bringing the community on board with all the policy changes that are needed?
Yes, yeah, I can answer that one. Yeah, and that's really important because climate change will impact all New Zealanders. So we have a recommendation, and we call it an enabling recommendation in our advice, which is about the government developing more effective mechanisms to get the views of all New Zealanders involved when determining how to prioritise climate actions and the policies that we need to create to meet emissions budgets and create more inclusive policy. Also, that localised transition planning is a really important one. Not central government saying how we should, how different regions should be transitioning, but community-led transition planning for the community, by the community, that's in line with the needs and aspirations of that particular community. So yes, very important. Carly, I'm not sure if you want to mention about education and the importance of that.
So yeah, I've maybe got lost with it before, but education is really at the kind of forefront of it, and that it's essential that we think about the workforce that's needed in the future, and we provide the education to redeploy, reskill the future workforce. And yeah.
Thank you both. I think this one might be for you, Karen, but have you read the advice from the CEO of Genesis Energy?
Yes. Yeah, so that's about electricity prices. Yes, so we are aware of that. And for those who are interested, there was a session on electricity prices earlier this morning, and we're working through that at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Does the Commission have an estimate of how many potential jobs could be generated through producing green hydrogen in New Zealand, and how beneficial this might be as a new export sector for New Zealand?
Yeah, and I think in general, if you've got any comments for us on green jobs across the board, not just from hydrogen, we're certainly keen to get more of an understanding of that. It's not something that comes out of our modelling, and that's because our modelling tends to be focused on industries that already exist. It's much more difficult to put in new industries into that and understand how they might play out just because we haven't seen them before. And so far you'll see more in our advice on areas where there might be a decline in certain industries. We'd be keen for any advice that you've got on green jobs, and particularly in green hydrogen as well.
Thank you both. Sorry, I've just got one more come through. Given some options were not included in our advice due to a lack of evidence, such as native forest regeneration and wider native ecosystems, what recommendations are we making on research to fill that gap?
Thanks for that. I have to actually confess, neither Carly or I works in the land space, and so we don't actually have, we do have Ben here. Do we think that Ben could come on and answer that question for us? You might have to.
Ben, you're good at thinking on your feet, aren't you?
Thanks. Ben works in this space, so he'll give you a better answer than I will.
Yeah, kia ora, thanks for the great question. So part of it is that we do consider some of it. We do consider native forest regeneration as part of our advice. In fact, a big focus of our recommendations in the land sector are about scaling up a large amount of new native forest establishment, and that includes both probably a mixture of some being planted and some being supported to naturally revert into forest through, pest control and fencing to kind of support those areas. But some of the other things you mentioned, such as mangroves, also applies to wetlands, don't feature in our advice, partly because we still need more research to understand their role in terms of sequestering carbon, and also because more work needs to be done to develop the monitoring and accounting systems so that we can accurately and robustly measure and monitor the changes in carbon and emissions from them across the whole country over time. And we make recommendations that the government work to improve its monitoring systems to be able to include those additional land sources in the future. So yeah, we do include the native forests, and we make recommendations to be able to better account for some of those other ecosystems in the future.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for chipping in for us. We've got another one here, a question on transport. If the technology was found to make emissions from car use overall the same as public transport use, would you recommend the technology as an alternative to public transport?
Yeah, and I can answer that one. In terms of transport and public transport and technologies in general, one of the principles in our advice is about creating options and keeping options open and not picking winners. And so in terms of that, we would certainly be open to that technology, and we wouldn't necessarily choose a particular mechanism for it. In terms of our advice, we're suggesting that we need to develop both the infrastructure and things that are needed to enable the uptake of electric vehicles. At the same time, we need to do more in the transport and public transport and active and modes of transport space as well. So we'd certainly be open to that. Of course, there's other things around that as well, like congestion and things, but certainly we're open to all options.
Thanks, Karen. Reducing consumption is an important aspect of the transition. How are you proposing that we address this, given that our economy is focused on growth and consumption?
Kelly, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So yeah, that's a great point. And again, happy to get your submissions talking about this. I think more specifically in the waste sector, we have prioritised reducing waste at source and reducing consumption there. Reducing waste there will help us reduce our waste emissions. In terms of the consumption and, sorry, I lost the question there. Oh gosh, Karen, would you like to just jump in while the question?
Are you just trying to find the question?
Yeah.
I think.
Oh, sorry, I've got it here. It says reducing consumption is an important aspect of the transition. How are you proposing that we address this, given that our economy is focused on growth and consumption? Yeah.
And again, this perhaps is where behaviour change can play a role. Reducing your consumption of high-emitting goods is a good way to reduce your personal carbon footprint. That's not something we've put explicitly in our advice, but again, would welcome your submissions on it. And we have set in our waste recommendations ambitious targets for waste reduction, waste recovery, to kind of reduce emissions there. I'm not sure if Karen wanted to fill my answer in.
Is there anything to add? No. We've just got a couple more. Can you suggest anything that New Zealanders can do now to make a difference?
I can have a go at that one. So I think that all action helps, and individual action is really, really essential and really important. And individuals can do things now to reduce their emissions footprints, and do the things like switching to an electric vehicle or insulation. And this is particularly cost effective if it's on its natural replacement cycle. And there are massive cost savings as well as emission savings to be gained from those. We also do realise that those options may not be available to everyone, so that's why we need those targeted policies to help other affected groups. In general, I think New Zealanders can do a lot, but we do have to appreciate that we're also aware that it's not just encouraging individuals to make small behaviour changes, it's also about creating a enabling system that makes those choices easy, low cost, affordable, and socially like normal. So that was kind of a bit of a long-winded answer there, but there are lots of things that people can do, and we would also really encourage them.
Thanks, Carly. I think we've just got one more at the moment. How do we get the behaviour change we need?
I'll take this one. Yeah, a little bit similar to behaviour change we need. So I think, again, we do need to, government and everyone needs to enable consumers to make low emissions choices and change behaviour. And this is not just, switching off a light bulb at the end of the day or switching to low carbon transport options. As well as doing those things, the government and business and all other stakeholders need to think about that systematic kind of enabling environment in which these choices are easy to do and low cost to do. So behaviour change is a bit of a complex one because it's not just about individuals, it's also about system change and making sure that the system allows consumers to make those choices easily.
Thanks, Carly. And we have no other questions through now. So I think if everyone's in agreement, we'll give you 15 more minutes back for your Friday afternoon. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and we hope you've learned a lot and got your questions answered. I'm going to pop a link to our consultation site in the chat now. As I said earlier, we'd love to hear from you. And I think Karen's just shared a link to our events page in the chat as well. So if you want to register for any upcoming webinars or have a look at any of our previous ones, you can take a look at those. So I think I'll hand over to Bevan now to lead us out with a karakia.
O kia ora, tēnā koutou mō koutou awhina I tukua mai hei tautoko I tā tātou hui me te kaupapa nei. So thank you all for your investment and time. Thank you for the many views and questions that you've put through. Kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu, ake, āmeni. Kia ora.